300 Roman warships, packed with over 100,000 men, pushed out to sea in 256 BC. Waiting for them was an even bigger Carthaginian fleet. Faster ships, veteran sailors with generations of ruling the waves. On paper, it was madness. Rome was a land power. Carthage was the master of the sea. By all logic, the Romans should have been crushed. And yet this battle, the Battle of Cape Ecnomus in 256 BC, would become one of the largest naval clashes in ancient history, and the turning point of the First Punic War. Welcome to Great History, the channel where we dive into the epic clashes that shaped the ancient world. If you're new here, hit subscribe so you don't miss more incredible stories like this one. In this episode, we'll uncover why this battle mattered so much, how it exposed the hidden limits of Carthage, how a single piece of Roman tech could tip the balance of the entire ancient world, and how, for the very first time, Roman legions would set foot on African soil. And trust me, the answer may not be the one you expect. Let's dive in. At the very start of the First Punic War, 264 BC, Rome hadn't even planned to be in Sicily. They got pulled in because their ally, the Mamertines of Messana, a mercenary band holding Messina, asked for help against Syracuse and Carthage. Rome sent troops to help an ally, not to start a decades-long war. But once Rome stepped in, the scope of the conflict grew, and their goals changed. Rome's first intention was just to keep Carthage from controlling Messana, but Sicily was the breadbasket too important to leave half-contested, rich, fertile plains that produced grain, olives, and wine. Major ports and natural harbors that let whoever held them control shipping routes, and a chain of coastal cities that acted like gateposts for movement between Italy, North Africa, and the Western Mediterranean. Whoever held Sicily could starve or feed whole regions, tax and profit from Mediterranean trade, and project power across key sea lanes. But after 23 years of deadlock on that island from 264 to 257 BC, the Romans started to see the bigger picture. They realized something simple but brutal. As long as Carthage still ruled the sea and had solid bases to work from, Rome would never be able to force them into a lasting peace. When I say solid bases, I mean concrete. Hard-to-take coastal strongholds and a logistical network that let them keep ships, men, and supplies moving even when Rome was dominant on land. Those bases were a mix of things: well-fortified port cities, Lilybaeum divided by Drepanum, Motia earlier in the period, nearby anchorages and lagoons where Carthaginian fleets could shelter, shipyards and depots for building and repairing galleys, and secure sea lines back to North Africa for grain, money, and reinforcements. Because those bases could be resupplied by sea, Rome's superiority in infantry didn't automatically translate into crushing Carthage inside Sicily. The enemy could simply shuttle men and supplies by sea around Roman blockades. That logistical resilience is exactly why Carthage could hold out in places like Lilybaeum for years. So, by the mid-252 BC, after years of stalemate in Sicily, Roman leaders concluded that Carthage could always resupply their Sicilian garrisons as long as they had naval superiority and their African homeland untouched. To break that cycle, Rome took a gamble bigger than anything they'd ever tried before. They would invade Africa itself. They built a fleet bigger than anything the Mediterranean had ever seen. 330 warships, plus a swarm of transport ships. The goal was to ferry around 26,000 elite legionaries across the Mediterranean, fighting the Carthaginian navy head-on, landing right on the coast of what we'd now call Tunisia, Carthage's backyard. Think about what that really meant. Building that many ships wasn't just about hammering planks together. Rome had to create a whole shipbuilding infrastructure, almost from scratch. Then came the manpower. Somewhere between 138,000 and 140,000 sailors and marines had to be recruited and trained. And before any of them could set sail, the Romans staged all the logistics at Ostia, their port near Rome. Imagine the buzz of activity ships lined up, supplies stacked high, men being drilled before they finally took the gamble and crossed open water. Meanwhile, Carthage were very much confident. Their leaders believed their navy was so superior that Rome would never dare to challenge them directly at sea. That kind of arrogance led them to sit back, reacting instead of acting. But when it finally sank in that Rome was coming straight for Africa, Carthage scrambled. They threw everything they had into the fight. 350 warships, carrying around 147,000 to 150,000 sailors and marines, and raced to intercept the Romans off southern Sicily. Both sides were sailing the same type of vessel, the quinquereme, a massive galley with 5 rows of oars on each side, cutting through the water with sheer muscle power. It was the backbone of Mediterranean navies at the time. But here's where things get really interesting, because even though the ships looked the same, the way each side used them was completely different. Carthage leaned hard into speed, agility, and the skill of their veteran crews. Their whole doctrine was built around maneuvers. They wanted to dart in fast, smash an enemy ship with that bronze-tipped ram on the prow, the rostrum, or cripple it by snapping its oars so it couldn't move. They had names for their tricks too. The diekplus, which was basically slicing through enemy lines like a spear, and the periplus, a move where you circle around and hit from the flank. Think of it like ancient naval dogfighting. The Romans? Whole different story. They were rookies at this kind of fancy seamanship, no centuries of naval tradition to fall back on. So instead of trying to outsail Carthage, they leaned on what they knew best: brutal, disciplined, hand-to-hand combat. But hold on, this is a naval battle, remember? That mismatch forced them to invent one of the most game-changing ideas in naval warfare, and we'll get to that when the battle truly begins. Here's the kicker. Both sides were nearly broke, stretched thin in men and money, but Rome still doubled down. Their leaders basically said, "We're willing to throw everything we've got into this war." The stakes couldn't have been higher. If Rome lost the coming battle at Cape Ecnomus, they wouldn't just lose maybe 10,000 men and empty their treasury. They risked something even bigger, the collapse of Roman morale and political will. And if that broke, Rome might never recover. That's the edge they were standing on. One slip, and the entire Roman Republic could have gone down with it. Now, let's zoom in on how the Romans lined up. Their fleet was under the joint command of 2 consuls, Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso Longus. Normally, having 2 bosses calling the shots at once could be a recipe for disaster. Roman history is full of moments where this kind of dual command led to miscommunication and mistakes. But at Ecnomus, surprisingly, it worked. That's part of what makes this battle so fascinating. The Romans set their fleet into a formation called a cuneus, basically a wedge made up of 4 divisions. Picture a giant arrowhead pointing straight at the Carthaginians. The 1st and 2nd divisions were right at the tip of that arrow, led personally by the 2 consuls. These weren't just ceremonial leaders sitting in the back, they were right up front, steering the fight. Behind them sat the 3rd division, which acted like a reserve force. And then, at the very back, was the 4th division, the most important of all. Those transport ships were loaded with the troops, siege equipment, and everything Rome needed to pull off its invasion of Africa. If those transports went down, the whole campaign was over before it even began. The Romans built their formation like a fortress on water. The wedge shape let them punch forward, while keeping their vulnerable transports tucked safely inside. Of course, this came at a cost. By locking themselves into such a dense, rigid formation, the Romans gave up a lot of freedom to maneuver. Would Rome's heavy, fortress-like wedge hold up against Carthage's nimble, battle-tested fleet? Or would the Carthaginians slip around them, look for weak spots, and smash those transports, ending Rome's African dreams right there on the waves? While the Romans were lining up, the Carthaginians under Hamilcar and Hanno had something much more clever in mind. These guys weren't about to just charge head-on into that wedge of Roman ships. They had a plan, a very sophisticated one. the kind of move you'd expect from people who had been ruling the seas for generations. Here's what they did. Instead of matching Rome's dense, blocky formation, Carthage spread its wings. Literally. They stretched their fleet wide on both sides, extending their flanks. Think of it like opening your arms, making yourself look bigger, ready to wrap around your opponent. At first glance, that sounds insane. Why would anyone deliberately weaken the very middle of their line? Wouldn't that just invite Rome to plow straight through? And that's exactly what the Carthaginians wanted the Romans to think. The soft center was a trap. As soon as Rome's 1st and 2nd divisions pressed forward, Carthage's center was supposed to fall back in a controlled retreat. The whole point was to lure the Roman spearhead away from what really mattered, those transport ships at the back. Because once the Roman front was drawn out and separated, the Carthaginian wings would swing in from both sides. That's the famous double envelopment move, the same kind of tactic Hannibal would later use to destroy Roman legions at Cannae on land. If it worked here, the Romans' heavy, slow-moving transports, along with their reserves, would be cut off, surrounded, and absolutely destroyed. And if those transports went down, well, Rome's invasion plan would sink with them. This really showed that Hamilcar and Hanno understood Rome's strengths and weaknesses down to the bone. They knew the Romans were brutal in close quarters fighting, but at sea, without their transports, they couldn't project power across the water. Basically, if you cut them off from being able to land troops, their punch didn't land. So, the battle begins. It didn't stay neat and organized for very long. What started as 2 massive fleets squaring off quickly broke apart into 3 separate battles happening at the same time. That's the thing with battles this size. Plans might look sharp on paper, but once the rams start crunching into hulls and men start shouting across the decks, it all splinters into chaos. Firstly, let's focus on the center front, because that's where the real drama kicked off. This was supposed to be Carthage's big trick. Remember, their plan was to make their middle look weak, almost like bait, so the Romans would charge forward and overextend themselves. And sure enough, the Roman vanguard, 2 of their lead divisions, took the bait and slammed straight into the Carthaginian center. For a moment, it looked like Carthage had them right where they wanted. But here's the twist. The Carthaginian center didn't hold up the way their admirals hoped. Instead of pulling back in a controlled retreat, they started crumbling under pressure. Why? Because of the Romans' secret weapon, the corvus. Let me pause for a second. The corvus was basically a boarding bridge with a big spike at the bottom. Picture a narrow boarding bridge with railings on the sides, maybe 36 feet long, with a sharp, heavy spike on the bottom that looked like a bird's beak. That's where it got its name, corvus, Latin for crow. The whole setup was attached to a pulley system, so Roman sailors could raise it up and then slam it down onto an enemy ship. When the spike bit into the enemy's deck, it locked the 2 ships together, basically forcing a boarding action. This gadget completely rewrote the rules of naval warfare. Why? Because it let Rome take their biggest strength, disciplined infantry, and turn it into an advantage at sea, a place where they were normally out of their depth. You see, the Carthaginians were masters of sailing and ramming. They could turn their ships on a dime and smash into you with deadly precision. But once the corvus locked them down, all that mobility vanished. Suddenly, these naval duels weren't about ships anymore, they were about soldiers. And the Romans had some of the toughest, most disciplined infantry in the ancient world. So when those Roman legionaries stormed across the corvus, it was like flipping the script. The Carthaginian crews weren't ready for that kind of brutal, up-close combat. Ship after ship fell to the Romans, and what was meant to be a clever trap quickly unraveled. The Carthaginian center collapsed faster than anyone expected. Many of their vessels were captured rather than sunk, which not only weakened their numbers but also gave the Romans more ships to work with. With the center collapsing so early, the Roman vanguard suddenly found themselves free. The trap that was supposed to swallow them had failed, and now those Roman divisions could swing around and throw their weight into other parts of the battle. What started as Carthage's grand plan turned into Rome's golden opportunity. While the Roman vanguard was tearing through the Carthaginian center, something just as dangerous was happening on the flank. The first Carthaginian squadron had swung wide and was now bearing down on the third Roman squadron, the one tasked with protecting the transport ships. These transports were the lifeline of the entire Roman campaign. They carried horses, supplies, and men who weren't fighters. If those went down, Rome's invasion of Africa was as good as finished. Because the Roman vanguard had rushed forward, the flank guarding those transports was suddenly exposed. Carthage saw the opening and went for the kill. Big, clumsy transports sitting there, chained to their escorts, while sleek Carthaginian warships started closing in, ready to ram. It looked like Rome's weak spot was about to be ripped wide open. But this is where the Roman commanders in the 3rd Squadron really showed their grit. Instead of freezing up, they adapted on the spot. First, they cut the towing ropes that tied their warships to the slower transports. That move instantly gave their war galleys back the ability to maneuver. Without it, they'd have been sitting ducks. They steered the whole squadron towards shallow waters near the coast. Carthaginian tactics relied heavily on speed and ramming, but in shallow water, ships can't pick up much momentum, and maneuvering becomes a nightmare. Think of it like a race car suddenly forced onto a muddy farm road. All that horsepower doesn't mean much anymore. By forming up in the shallows and turning their ships to face outward toward the open sea, the Romans created a solid wall of defense. Carthaginian ships couldn't swing around and hit them from the sides. They were forced to attack straight on, and a frontal assault meant running headfirst into Rome's secret weapon, the Corvus boarding bridge. Then, it turned into the bloodiest, most hard-fought clash of the entire battle for the Romans. Even so, their defensive gamble worked. By neutralizing Carthage's edge in speed and maneuverability, and by turning the fight into something closer to a land battle, the Roman 3rd Squadron held the line. They kept the transports safe and bought precious time for the rest of the fleet. Out on the open sea, the far flank Carthage had its fastest, most maneuverable squadron, commanded by Hanno. These were the sleek warships, coming straight at the Roman rear guard. The idea was simple: punch through the Romans in the back, smash the support fleet, and leave the whole invasion force stranded. You can imagine the clash. Carthaginian ships darting in and out, trying to ram and peel off Roman vessels, while the Romans held steady, refusing to break formation. The Romans weren't trying to outmaneuver anyone. They were trying to hold a line long enough to survive. Now here comes the part that decided everything. Remember how the Roman vanguard had just crushed the Carthaginian center earlier in the fight? Well, once they were done mopping that up, those same Roman squadrons wheeled around and came charging back across the battlefield. This was the nightmare scenario for Carthage. Their whole plan depended on keeping the Romans tied down long enough for the double envelopment to snap shut. But with the center gone and the Roman vanguard freed up, the trap backfired. Instead of being surrounded, the Romans turned the tables and slammed into Carthage's squadrons from behind. Hamilcar's idea to pull off a double envelopment at sea was bold. Honestly, it was the kind of big, daring swing you'd expect from Carthage, a city that had been the king of the seas for generations. Pulling off a maneuver like that isn't easy, even on land. And out on the water, it's 10 times harder. Every ship is moving, the wind shifts, oars fall out of rhythm, visibility changes, signals get missed. The fleet was just too big, the conditions too messy, and the communication too fragile. Ships weren't infantry that could hold a steady line. They drifted, they collided, they lost spacing. To pull off something as complicated as a double envelopment, you need what today's military folks would call C2 command and control, and you need it to be airtight. Every unit has to know exactly what it's supposed to do, when to move, and how to stay connected with the bigger plan. That's where Carthage stumbled. The plan started okay, but the problem was the center collapsed too fast. They didn't just lure the Romans forward, they got chewed up by the Corvus boarding bridges and Roman infantry discipline before the wings could finish their job. And with the Corvus in play, Rome had turned naval combat into a place where Roman discipline and training made all the difference. But, and this is key, the idea itself wasn't bad. In fact, it was brilliant. How do we know that? Because a generation later, Hannibal, Hamilcar's own son, pulled off the exact same maneuver on land at Cannae in 216 BC, and it went down in history as one of the greatest tactical masterpieces ever. That double envelopment crushed a Roman army that outnumbered him, and it's still studied in military academies today. So when you look back at Ecnomus, you can't really say Carthage's thinking was wrong. The doctrine itself, the concept of surrounding the enemy and squeezing them from all sides, was solid. The problem was how it played out on water. That's why historians usually see Ecnomus not as a failure of Punic brainpower, but as a failure of execution under tough conditions, especially when you're splitting your forces into separate fights. The concept was genius, it just needed the right battlefield. Looking back, Ecnomus also shines a light on a deeper Carthaginian weakness. They weren't bad at fighting. In fact, they pulled off some smart tactical wins in other battles. But time and time again, they kept hoping Rome would just give up out of exhaustion. That miscalculation, thinking Rome would lose heart, turned out to be one of the deadliest mistakes they ever made. Rome, on the other hand, had one thing Carthage never matched: absolute commitment. Rome didn't care how long it took or how bloody it got. They would chase the war until they hit their final objective. Roman soldiers didn't need to outsail the Carthaginians. They just needed to get close, drop the corvus, and fight like they were on solid ground. But there was a catch. Not long after Ecnomus, a massive storm wrecked a bunch of Roman ships. The corvus, while brilliant in battle, made ships heavy and clumsy. It wasn't a long-term solution. Still, Rome didn't mope about it. They learned, they adjusted, and soon enough they were dropping the corvus and moving towards sleeker, more effective naval tactics. That willingness to adapt, that was Rome's real military inheritance from Ecnomus. Sure, Rome bled in this fight. Somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 Carthaginian sailors and soldiers were either killed or taken prisoner. Compare that with Rome's 10,000 dead, and you're looking at a 3-to-1, maybe even 4-to-1 ratio. Carthage leaned heavily on mercenaries, and losing that many men meant a financial and logistical nightmare. Training, paying, and replacing them was crushingly expensive, especially for a state already stretched thin. You could say this battle didn't just sink ships, it drained Carthage's wallet dry. Rome lost about 24 ships and around 10,000 men, that's no small thing. But Carthage? Their losses were on a completely different level. 30 of their ships went to the bottom, and, more humiliating than that, 64 ships were captured intact. That's like handing your enemy the keys to your own armory. Those 64 captured ships weren't burned or sunk. Rome could actually use them either to resupply, reinforce their fleet, or squeeze out every ounce of intel they could. That's where the Roman boarding device, the corvus, showed its real worth. It didn't just win battles. It let Rome steal ships whole, like trophies. That sort of humiliation cuts deeper than attrition ever could. But here's where things go from bad to worse for Carthage. This Roman victory opened the sea lanes wide. The fleet could now patch itself up, reload, and set sail straight for Africa. For the first time ever, Roman soldiers would land on Carthaginian soil. That was the ultimate humiliation. Carthage had spent generations building up its legend as the untouchable naval power of the Mediterranean. Ecnomus shattered that reputation. Suddenly, Rome was the one dictating the pace, the terms, and the direction of the war. Yes, the African campaign under Regulus eventually ended in disaster, but the fact that Rome pulled it off mattered more than the short-term loss. They had shown two things. One, that the goal of invading Carthage was possible, and two, that they had the guts to actually do it. That forced Carthage to shift its focus away from Sicily, dragging resources back home to defend its very heartland. Suddenly, the whole axis of the war had tilted. In the end, Ecnomus became the undeniable yardstick for Carthage's humiliation. They'd been the masters of the Mediterranean for centuries. But here came Rome, newcomers at sea, using bold strategy, a clever little piece of tech, and sheer political willpower to break through. That mix of guts, brains, and stubbornness carved the path for Rome to rise as the true power of the Mediterranean. So, what do you think, was Rome's gamble at Ecnomus pure genius, or just reckless stubbornness? Drop your thoughts in the comments, I'd love to hear them. And if you enjoyed this dive into history, hit that like button, share it with a friend, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next campaign. Thanks for sticking around until the end. Take care, and I'll see you tomorrow.